Customer Council. My name is Tracy Berardi, and I'm Program Manager of the Council. Today we're going to discuss Cloud Service Agreements. Version 2.0 of the CSCC Practical Guide to Cloud Service Agreements has just been published and can be downloaded from the CSCC website. You'll see the URL here on the title slide. This afternoon, following the webinar, we will post the presentation slides and a recording. So check out our website and the CSCC YouTube channel this afternoon. Now I would like to introduce you to John Meegan, Mike Edwards, Claude Baudoin, and Karolyn Schalk as contributors to the paper and today's expert speakers. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you'd like to pose a question, please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar toolbar. And with that brief introduction, I'll turn it over to you, John Meegan.
Thanks, Tracy. So as Tracy mentioned, the topic of our talk today is the Practical Guide to Cloud Service Agreements that was originally published back in April of 2012. And over the past several months, the team has been working on the version 2 update, which, as Tracy mentioned, is available on the CSCC website at the URL highlighted at the bottom of the chart. And so on our talk today, we'll take you through the guidance and some of the strategies provided in the paper that's targeted really at decision makers within cloud customer organizations. So the goal of the paper is to help these decision makers effectively evaluate and compare cloud service agreements from different cloud providers. And so before we jump into the details, what I'd like to do is provide just a little bit of background on the CSCC itself. So Tracy, if we can move to the next chart. So the CSCC is a customer advocacy organization that provides guidance and levies requirements on various cloud standards bodies. And to that end, the Council develops collateral like best practices, use cases, does some standard gap analysis, etc. And over the past 4 years, the Council has grown to over 500 member companies. The collateral that the CSCC has delivered since its inception is highlighted on this chart. And at the bottom is a preliminary list of projects that the CSCC is working on this year. And so I'd certainly encourage folks who are interested in any of these topics to consider joining the appropriate work group and engaging either as a contributor or a reviewer. Tracy, let's move to the next chart. So this chart highlights the key changes that were made to the Practical Guide in the version 2 revision. Overall, the high-level flow of the paper stayed the same, but each of the major sections were updated, some more than others. One significant terminology change was actually made throughout the paper. The term service level agreement was replaced by cloud service agreement to more accurately reference the broad agreement that's established between cloud customers and providers. And so the term SLA is now used to reference that part of the broader CSA that deals specifically with service levels. Then the current CSA landscape section was updated substantially to reflect current market dynamics. The 10 steps that comprise the guide for evaluating CSAs remain the same, but changes were made to each of those steps to reflect current best practices. And then, as you'd expect, references to new cloud computing standards, along with references to several CSCC white papers that were published in the past 2 years, were added as well. So with that as background, the remainder of the presentation takes you through sort of a tour of the white paper along with its recommendations. So Tracy, let's move to chart 4. So in general, the CSA is comprised of 3 major artifacts. The customer agreement describes the overall relationship between the customer and the provider, including explicit definitions of the roles, responsibilities, and processes that are actually used by the cloud provider. The acceptable use policy outlines activities that providers consider to be improper or illegal use of their service. And this is actually one of the areas of the CSA where there's considerable consistency across cloud providers. And then the SLA describes levels of service using various attributes like availability and serviceability and performance, right? And the SLA actually specifies thresholds and financial penalties associated with violations of these thresholds. Now, it is important to note that this sort of high-level classification is not complete, nor is it uniformly adopted in the industry. There is no standard nomenclature that's used across cloud providers to specify their CSAs, and actually providers can modify their contract structure and terms at any time. And so as a result of that, customers have to pay close attention to CSA language and clauses. Otherwise, the likelihood of there being a mismatch in expectations versus actual service terms is going to be pretty high. And so service level guarantees for infrastructure as a service are certainly better defined than SaaS or PaaS, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily meet customers' expectations. Most public cloud infrastructure services are available only through non-negotiable standard contracts which strictly limit the provider's liability. And as you'd expect, service levels are certainly more flexible, and there's more room for negotiation for private cloud deployments than public cloud deployments. However, customers will certainly end up paying more for that flexibility. And of course, size matters. Larger companies have more power to negotiate favorable terms, but we do expect that over time, these better terms are going to trickle down to small and medium-sized businesses as well. So Tracy, let's move to the next chart. So this chart highlights the 10 steps that cloud customers should take to evaluate and compare cloud service agreements from different cloud providers. And the ultimate goal is to mitigate risk and ensure that an appropriate level of service is delivered that supports specific business requirements. This 10-step guidance is really the core or the guts of the white paper. And the charts that follow are going to cover each of these steps in detail. Tracy, let's move to the next chart. So from a cloud customer perspective, one of the significant areas of risk involved with cloud computing is the division of activities and responsibilities between the cloud customer and the cloud service provider. It's critically important to have a full understanding of who is responsible for which activities to help ensure that there are no gaps that could potentially lead to problems in service usage down the road. The graphic on the right is taken from the ISO Cloud Computing Reference Architecture, and it highlights the specific roles and sub-roles that need to be understood. The CSCC Practical Guide focuses primarily on the cloud service customer and the cloud service provider roles and sub-roles along with their interaction. The white paper only briefly touches on the cloud server partner role and sub-roles. And so cloud customers certainly need to ensure that the activities and responsibilities of the various sub-roles of the cloud service provider, are clearly understood, and that the interactions that are critical to their service delivery are appropriately defined in the CSA. One important area for customers to consider is who's responsible for detecting and then reporting incidents where the cloud service fails to meet some aspect of the CSA. This can include outages where the cloud service is unavailable, or may include cases where performance fails to meet stated service levels, etc. So how such incidents are detected must be established. It may end up being the responsibility of the customer, in which case appropriate monitoring technology may need to be put in place. It's also important to be clear about how incidents are then reported and tracked until resolved. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Claude Baudoin, who will take us through steps 2 through 5. Claude, over to you.
Thank you, John. Hello, everyone. I'm Claude Baudoin. So when we get to step 2, having established those responsibilities in step 1, then we turn to what are the business level policies that are going to drive the considerations or the characteristics of the cloud service agreement that matter to the customer and that are going to support the business adequately. So there is as you can see on the left hand of the slide, a fairly long list of things that fall in the scope of business policies that are things that should really be discussed with business line managers, with executive management, with financial management, with legal management, to make sure that the CSA that is signed with the cloud provider is not going to contradict or weaken some of the policies of the organization that is the customer. So there's a part of the CSA that is not at all about the technology and the monitoring and the performance of the technology of the cloud. It is about what are the what is the business contract part of the agreement? What are the financial terms? How is billing performed? At what frequency? How long does it take to activate the service once the agreement is signed? How are things governed? What are the mechanisms for liaison between the two organizations or the multiple organizations when multiple cloud providers are involved, or when there is a cloud broker or cloud carrier involved? What are the rules about notification and alerts and managing those incidents? How are things escalated? What are an example is that if an organization defines priorities in a certain way because their business is impacted when the cloud service is down, you don't want that priority to be considered something critical inside the customer organization, but for some reason related to which services are down or how long they are down, it's not considered a high priority by the cloud provider, etc. We've encountered issues where support or prime time is defined according to the time zone of the provider, which is mostly located, for example, in the U.S., which means that the customer's business could be down in Singapore for an entire working day without the provider considering that this is a prime time outage, etc. And there's lots of things related to the actual licensing of the service. When is it renewed? Can it be transferred to a company that acquires you as a customer? Conversely, is that service preserved if the provider is acquired? What happens if they cease business? What happens if they subcontract some of their services, etc.? So the concern here, again, is aligning the policies that are contained in the CSA with the policies that are required for the customer business to be correctly enabled by and not hampered by the cloud service. There is an aspect of this that's related to data, which is the data policies box on the right-hand side of this slide. And we'll come to those again in other parts of the CSA paper later on, but they have a lot to do with business policies, again, related to the location of data, the authorization or the notification that data is going to be moved from one place to another, the ability of law enforcement authorities to seize data, and issues of privacy and availability of the data. So if we move on to step 3, Tracy, to the next slide. Now, the next thing that needs to be understood, this is still, if you want, part of the context of what is going to be inside the CSA, is to understand the differences between what should be the content of a CSA, depending what service model and what deployment model you as a customer may have chosen. The service and deployment models go back all the way to the NIST reference architecture for the cloud, defined several years ago. When we talk about service model, we talk about whether it is infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service. And the content of the CSA will vary accordingly. Infrastructure as a service is more similar in terms of content to traditional ITO, or information technology outsourcing, and the metrics will be mostly focused on availability and performance of the actual infrastructure, the servers, the network connections, the data storage. When you talk about platform as a service, then you have a distinction for which you can go to the full paper to understand exactly how we define these things. I'm not going to take the time here to describe this in detail, but you have a distinction between what the CSA should contain when we're talking about so-called integrated solutions versus deploy-based solutions. And then there are external references that are relevant to the orchestration of services in the case of platform as a service, and in particular the Tosca standard from OASIS, a fairly well-known standards defining organization in the area of system integration. When it comes to software as a service, you really shouldn't have to care or define in the CSA things related to the availability of the infrastructure at all. What you care about is whether the user has access from his or her vantage point to the application, to the functionality of the application with sufficient performance and availability. So you're talking about end-to-end performance, and so that's going to be very dependent in terms of which functionality is available when on the specific application. A CRM, an ERP, a document management SaaS platform is going to have different metrics there and different characteristics. When we talk about the deployment model on the right-hand side, we're talking about whether the service being contracted is a private cloud, a public cloud, a hybrid cloud, or a community cloud. So there's there's several groupings there. Hybrid and public and community are very similar. Hybrid, of course, is going to inherit some of the characteristics of both public and private. And on the other hand, there's a distinction between a private cloud on premises, which is what a lot of large companies are doing, which is basically an evolution of data center consolidation using cloud concepts, in which case an external provider may not be involved, except maybe the carrier, but not a cloud provider outside. But on the other hand, a CSA is still a good idea internally for the IT department to set essentially contractually with its internal users what services it is going to provide. So an internal CSA makes sense. For an outsourced private cloud, this is very similar to a traditional hosting agreement, and there is plenty of literature on IT outsourcing contracts here. And for public clouds, of course, this is where we have the stronger requirements to ensure that the fact that you're in a multi-tenant environment still meets the criteria that are important for the customer. So these are some of the considerations here that you need to look at in this case. Let's go to step 4. So now, having looked at, okay, what is the context, what are the business policies, what are the what model are we in, or models are we in, we can start moving towards what are going to be the measurable aspects of the service by identifying which performance objectives are critical to the business of the customer. And sometimes it comes down to language and to the semantics of what we call availability during which time, what level of ability, what actually is availability, and what are the, again, response times, how are they measured, from what point to what point, etc. And there are standard definitions, or at least tentative standard definition of these, and the IEEE, among others, has established such definitions, and in the paper we give the full reference to the proper IEEE document that describes that. When defining in the CSA what makes up the performance of the service, you need to consider not only the actual computer hardware, storage servers, network routers, computing servers, but you also need to consider the facility itself, backup, air conditioning, power, etc., because obviously if there is no metrics and no performance objectives about the facility aspect, then the service might be at risk if anything happens. Then the metrics related to the computing hardware and the facilities needs to be based on the needs of the business, and that's where, for example, the prime time hours that matter to the business as opposed to the hours at which most of the provider personnel are present on site make a significant difference. So in the guide, we have a table that occupies essentially one page that provides a sample set of content of the CSA to define specific metrics, and we chose as example server availability, network availability, and response time. These are 3 columns in that table, and we show you in that table what are some of the constraints to look at, what the CSA should say about how those metrics are collected, how often, and what are some of the ways in which they're used in a service agreement to, for instance, dictate what should be escalated when the metrics are not met, and what should be the consequences on billing and potentially on penalties and refunds that could be specified in the CSA with respect to those metrics. These are only examples. We did not cover the entire laundry list, if you want, of all the content that the CSA should have about all forms of performance objectives, but we give sample content in the full paper. And let's go to step 5. So that's another aspect. So the critical issues about what's contained in the CSA include obviously performance, availability and response time. The importance of security, of course, cannot be overstated given the nervousness, if you want, that many people have with respect to the cloud still. So if you don't want management to be antsy or to be overly concerned about whether you are weakening your company's security provisions by going to the cloud, that's why you need the CSA to be extremely specific with respect to security provisions. You may also point out, of course, to senior management that security, regardless how well you do your job, is not perfect inside your own company, and that your cloud provider can actually bring to bear excellent security resources that are to your advantage. But it's very important to counter that concern, especially in a multi-tenant environment, by specifying security extremely well in the CSA. Security concerns all assets. The assets are not just the information. The applications also need to be secured, for instance, so that they cannot be infiltrated in order to create a virus or Trojan horse attack. You need to have a security classification scheme for all your assets. So if you don't have such a security classification scheme already inside your company and you go to the cloud, you're going to have issues because you're not going to have a basis to discuss with the provider how they protect your assets in the cloud. So it's a good idea then to fill that gap and do that security classification. And there's additional useful guidance in papers by the Cloud Security Alliance. We provide the references in the paper. So when you evaluate the security, there are certain substeps of this step 5. Define or analyze the sensitivity of the various assets. Understand which laws apply, which regulatory requirements apply. You know that now in certain states and jurisdictions, you actually have to reveal if you had a breach of security, which can be an image problem for your company. So you need to evaluate that, establish the metrics, implement certain policies and procedures, including technical measures to monitor and detect the unexpected movement of data by, for instance, a disgruntled employee who is shipping data out to a place where it's not authorized. There are means to try to block that or detect it. And then you have to assess what the provider commits to you in the CSA, including what are their security capabilities, how do they govern security, and how do they comply with the security policies of the CSA. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Mike Edwards to start talking about step 6.
Thank you very much, Claude. If we could move on to that's lovely. So Mike Edwards here, and we'd like to move on now to look at the next aspect, which is the management of the cloud services that you're taking on board. So the first statement is perhaps rather obvious, is that you must, as a cloud service customer, look to monitor and manage the cloud services that you're using. And this involves a number of different aspects that you need to get on top of. So we have the question of auditing that the provider's management system is itself adequate. Now, it may not be possible in many certainly public cloud environments for you to necessarily send in the auditors to validate the management system, but many cloud service providers will instead have third-party auditors certify systems, and you should be looking for those certifications to prove the adequacy of those management systems that they've got in place. The next question then is to ensure yourself that the cloud service you're taking on board has appropriate monitoring and reporting in place that gives you visibility into the behavior of the service and your usage of the service. And this may be available as a set of monitoring and reporting interfaces supplied by the cloud provider, or it may require you as the customer to put monitoring and reporting in place on your side of the fence, which is monitoring the overall usage of the cloud services by your users. And it may indeed involve some combination of both. But it's important to validate for yourself that appropriate monitoring and reporting is available for those services. Associated with monitoring and reporting is the whole question of measurement and metering. You're paying for these cloud services, so you're obviously going to ask the question whether you're getting what you're paying for. And you want to validate that you want to know what usage you're making, and then relate that to the metering that, almost without doubt, the cloud service provider is doing, because that's based on which they're going to bill you. So you need to be able to check back that your usage matches the billing that you're coming up against. Another thing to spend some time looking at is the whole question of the provisioning of resources, whatever those resources may be. So, you know, on an IaaS type service, you might be asking the question of how quickly can I allocate a new virtual machine that I want to use. With a SaaS application, it may be more the question of how much does it take to onboard a new user. Whatever's relevant to the particular service. And you need to examine those provisioning processes and assure yourself that the speed of provisioning of whatever meets your requirements. Then there's the question of change management. In the case of change management, with cloud services, you're handing over responsibility for change management for certain things to the cloud service provider. If you had all the stuff in-house, you'd be responsible. But in the case of cloud services, that's not the case. So, for example, you may be using a service that already has, for example, a particular operating system installed. And the whole question comes into play then of, okay, well, how often and when does the cloud service provider update that operating system? And that may be very important in the case of, as we've seen over the last year or so, important security patches being put in place. Vulnerabilities are discovered, reported. You, as the customer, need to know that that operating system that you're using in the cloud service, that's been patched up to the right level to get rid of any vulnerabilities that are known. So there needs to be some degree of transparency of process about how change management is done by the cloud service provider and how those changes are notified, ideally ahead of time, and reported when they're done, so you know that they've been done. So all those aspects filter into the overall service management. And of course, if you are using tools on-premise to manage your IT operations, as you probably are, another question that goes along with all these questions that we've asked so far is, can I connect my cloud management software to the particular service that I'm now taking on board? That must be possible, otherwise you may be having to buy another tool or another product in order to manage the service. That's another very important question to ask. Okay, if we could move on to the next slide, and step 7, please. Thank you. So we now have to look a little bit on the black side. We have to look at what it takes to prepare for service failures, and how we manage service failures. So this is where the cloud service itself fails to meet the behavior we expect of it. And this obviously can be a spectrum of different possibilities. We may be looking at a complete failure, it's completely unavailable, it's out of service. Or it's not a complete failure, but we're getting significant performance issues, for example, so that the application or service that we're using just isn't behaving adequately for our needs. Things are taking too long. So we need to have processes in place ourselves of what we do when we detect failures of these kinds. So the first thing is, can we make ourselves aware when these situations occur? Have we got the detection in place? Have we got appropriate alerting in place? Now, there may be some facilities available from the provider, and if that's true, that's great. We obviously will need to plug our customer systems into whatever monitoring and notification systems the provider has. But it's also very likely that we're going to need customer-side monitoring, observing, and maybe having a layer in place that observes our users using the service and checks that things are not failing outright, or is able to validate the performance. The performance is within our requirement bounds. So in the case where we, the customer, determine that a failure occurred, then we're also going to need to assure ourselves that we've got appropriate processes in place by which we can report those failures to the provider so that they can do something to fix them. So we need to make sure we have our process in place. And of course, in a larger organization, it may be a range of different staff, so maybe different roles who might initially detect the problem. Maybe the end users do. Maybe we have a totally automated system. That'd be great. And then it's our administrators who are going to detect the failures. But whatever the process is, we then need to have a way of our people reporting the problem that we're detecting to the provider. Of course, if the provider detects the problem, we would hope that the provider themselves would start to act to fix whatever the problem is. But in either case, we also need then to understand what the provider processes are when they have a failure reported. How do they deal with that? What are the steps they're going to take? What sort of time schedules do they have? And obviously this will depending on the severity of the problem. We may have a severity rating and a severity 1, 2, 3, 4, and we might be looking for particular timescale objectives for fixing the issue. So a complete outage, that's a severity 1, we want it dealt with very quickly. Minor performance problem that we may be prepared to have longer to get fixed. Now, when we do find some kind of service failure, another thing to bear in mind is we, as a customer, would expect to see some remedies for those failures. And in the case of cloud services, the typical remedies that are in place are service credits. In other words, we get some amount of money back against the money we've been paying for the cloud service. That's the typical process. We'd like to see in the cloud service agreement clear statements of what those remedies are and how they're triggered. And it is often the case with cloud service agreements that you will find limitations of one kind or another that limit the liability of the cloud service provider for certain types of failures. For example, ones that might be outside their control. Perhaps you're connecting through the internet to the cloud service provider. That's a typical case. If there's an internet outage, the cloud service provider may say that's a limitation. We can't do anything about that. It's not under our control. So we are not going to be liable for failures of that kind. But you need to be fully aware of what those are. And of course, if there are unacceptable limitations on your part, you would be well advised not to use service having those limitations. If we can move on to step 8, please, the next chart. And looking even more on the black side, we also have to consider the case of a disaster and how we would recover for a disaster. These we hope don't happen very often. And they have to be part of a responsible business continuity plan on your part as a customer. And you will need to have plans in place for recovering your applications, recovering your data, recovering communications capabilities that you're using in the face of some disaster. And so we can imagine the kind of disaster we get: earthquakes, major power outages, storms, and so on that can knock out cities or individual regions. How are we going to deal with that kind of a problem? And one of the first questions to ask is, who's responsible for doing what? You can, with some cloud service providers, have the provider providing disaster recovery in effect because, for example, they operate multiple data centers and they will automatically spread your load across those data centers. That might be the case, for example, for a SAS service. In other cases, the responsibility you'll find is in part or in large part the responsibility of the customer. So in some cases, you may find that, particularly infrastructure services, the provider will say, yes, we've got multiple different data centers in different locations, different countries, different regions, whatever. But you, Mr. Customer, you have to explicitly put applications and data into the different data centers, and you're responsible for replicating them across that different zones. And you have to, therefore, provide that level of business continuity if you want to use it. So those responsibilities must be made absolutely clear, very clear up front what we're able to do to cope with disasters. And some of the techniques that we've got here, of course, are quite well known. Multiple redundant data centers I've already talked about. Replication of data stores is another standard technique, although how that's done can vary depending on what kind of data store we're dealing with and what kind of updates are going against that data store, where they're coming from. You may want to have multiple redundant networks connecting your users to the service. You may want to have multiple app instances spread around on different locations, and you want to put technology in place to perform automated failover. So if you find that one data center gets taken out for whatever reason, that automatically all customers are redirected to a different data center where your applications are still running. And one last thing to think about is potential for complete failure of the service provider. Simple ideas, they go out of business, for example. And you need to have some contingency plan in place for how you might deal with that. It's the ultimate disaster where the whole service provider disappears for some reason or another. So you need to have contingency plans in place as a customer that could deal with that and potentially fail over from one cloud service provider to another cloud service provider, a different one, or possibly to your own infrastructure in-house. If we can move to step 9, please. There's a need to make sure that you have effective governance in place for your use of cloud services. So governance is the overall control of the use of the systems. It's made more complicated, of course, as so much is in cloud computing, by the split there is between the customer side of things and the provider side, and the fact that some control on the other side is fairly going out of your control, because there are going to be some elements of the environment controlled by the cloud service provider, and your governance processes have to take that into account. So the kind of things you need to have in place as a customer are, for example, periodic assessments of your use of the cloud services. You want to be having reports of the service levels you're getting, of compliance statements. Is the provider meeting legal compliance requirements, for example, often assured by periodic certifications. So again, you need to have appropriate periodic assessments of these things in place to make sure that the provider is meeting your needs as a customer. You'll need to have reports, again, on a regular basis. There'll typically be sets of key indicators that you'll care about: performance targets, transaction rates, data backups, all kinds of stuff. Also, you'll care about service failures when they occur. You'll need reports on those. Are there problems? How many problems? Can we live with that level of problem? So problem reporting and status is something you'll want to know. And status includes not only the reporting, but also, of course, the fixing of the problems. Did they get fixed? Did they get fixed within the timescales that the provider was promising? You'll want good change notification processing. So you want to be informed that changes are going to occur. You need to know ahead of time so you can take any actions that you need to as a customer. and of course when changes take place you don't inform when they're completed too. That's obviously a bad thing, of course, because things like security patches are great if the provider's taking care of them for you, but you like to know that they've been done. There's also the question of request processing, and this is where you as a customer are asking for some kind of change, an upgrade of some kind, expansion of resources that you need to use, whatever it is. And so you'll need to have reports on how your requests are being handled. Are they being done within a reasonable time frame? Are they done as requested? And so on. And then perhaps last but not least is the whole question of user satisfaction, particularly a case where you've got lots of end users, whether they're employees or customers using your systems. Is the cloud service keeping the users happy, or are there problems? You certainly need to be checking on that. Another thing you need as part of government's policy is a clearly understood escalation process, so that when there are problems discovered, there is escalation both within your organization as a customer, so the problems are reported to appropriate levels of management, and also know that there's an escalation process in place with the provider to raise the concern over a problem that isn't being fixed, or a problem that's getting severe. And frankly, the level of escalation goes everywhere right up to top management and includes the potential for termination of the service agreement if the problem's getting too severe. Okay, so moving on to our final step, step 10. You need to understand how to leave, what the exit process is. So you need to plan from the beginning that when you take on board a cloud service, you need to plan how you would leave should the need arise. So any cloud service agreement should deal explicitly with what the exit plan looks like if you, the customer, decide you want to terminate using the cloud service and go somewhere else. So the exit plan needs to have clear procedures. How does it take place? You need to be examining whether you can get assistance in the exit plan from the provider. This may very well be necessary, particularly, for example, with SaaS services where the data, your customer data, may be in the SaaS service, but you have to now get it out, and it may not be possible to get it directly out. You may require the provider to do things for you. You may need to know what fees there might be for any assistance, for any exit process. You need to be clear on how the customer data is retrieved. If you want to get it back, it's your data. You will not be able to carry on your business without it. And you also need to be assured that while the exit process is taking place, that your business will continue until at least the exit process is completed and you've now an orderly transition of your business to somewhere else. You should also be looking out for requirements for the provider to delete or make otherwise inaccessible all copies of your customer data. And of course, you need to be thinking carefully when it's the provider that's been doing the backups of your data. That's a great thing while you're using the service. You want backups, you want replication, you don't want to lose your data. But of course, when you leave, you want all those copies to be destroyed effectively. You don't want to have them hanging around. And that may even stretch to a requirement to have the provider cleanse log and other audit data of information about you, your users, your customers. Because a lot of that kind of information would normally be kept in logs, login information, all this kind of stuff. And ideally it would be removed. But we have to remember, of course, that in many jurisdictions there may be retention of records for some specified period required by law. So we just have to bear that in mind. Have to look at what regulations are necessary. Okay, so that's covered all of our 10 steps. I'd like now to hand back over to John Meegan to wrap up and conclude. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So this summary chart sort of nets out the critical actions that were covered on the previous charts. First and foremost, customers need to develop a strong business case and strategy for transitioning to cloud and make sure that there's strong buy-in across their organization. This is going to provide the foundation for assessing and comparing CSAs from different providers. Certainly functional and non-functional requirements need to be assessed, so attributes that were covered in detail on the previous charts, like performance, availability, security, privacy, legal and regulatory requirements, should all be adequately addressed in the CSA. In addition, customers are going to need to ensure their CSA includes the ability to see, assess, and react to key performance measurements and understand the notification process when service issues arise. Business continuity is also a must for all businesses, large and small. Cloud customers are going to bear the risk of disaster scenarios. So as a result, it's going to be critical that they understand the provider's ability to support their data preservation strategy, and that they test and verify the disaster recovery plan prior to production deployment. And then lastly, customers need to ensure that they, as Mike was saying, that they define an exit plan, and that plan is capable of being implemented with minimal disruption to the customer. Tracy, let's move on to the next chart. And so to wrap things up, I certainly encourage everyone on the call to consider joining the CSCC and getting involved in one or more of the CSCC working groups as either a contributor or a reviewer. The time commitment is minimal, and I can tell you that everyone I've worked with on a project has been very happy and has had a very positive experience. We do have some very interesting work that's teed up for the remainder of the year, so it's a really good time to engage. Tracy, next chart. And so here's a list of the collateral that's been produced by the CSCC on topics ranging from cloud service agreements to cloud security to cloud migration and interoperability, etc. Access to these papers is free and doesn't require membership, so please feel free to leverage any or all of these papers that are of interest to you. And so with that, Tracy, I will hand it over to you to start the Q&A.
Great, thanks, John. We do have a couple questions in. The first, I think this is a good question for Claude. In step 5, you advised to establish security metrics. Could you give some examples of measurable security metrics which are not simply binary, yes or no?
That's a very good question. Thank you, Tracy, and thank you to the questioner. If you look at the content of a standard like ISO 27002, you will find that the types of security aspects that are mentioned in there often obviously lend themselves to binary answer. Is this provided, yes or no? Does this happen, yes or no? But there are a bunch of security metrics that can also be defined on a non-binary scale. I'll just give you a few examples that come to mind right now. You can certainly try to specify in a CSA or get the, or at least put in the CSA that the provider will report to you things like the number of attacks that passed through the firewall and were only detected by an intrusion detection system after they passed the firewall. You can ask them to tell you or to specify how many security engineers do they employ who have CISSP certifications. You could ask what is the age of the oldest unpatched vulnerability in the operating systems present in their footprint. Every provider, every IT organization has usually a backlog, hopefully small, but of vulnerabilities that were communicated by the makers of the hardware, the software, etc. Not everything can be patched, 5 seconds after the vulnerability has been communicated. But as we well know from some celebrated incidents, sometimes you have people who have systems with year-old vulnerabilities that have not been patched. So a professional cloud provider should manage that backlog very carefully, and the oldest unpatched vulnerability should not be very old. So you can ask about the number and the age of those vulnerabilities. You can ask how many incidents in the last 30 days resulted in downtime. You can ask what is the out of the total unavailability time that was measured over the past, let's say, 30 days, how much of that time, what percentage was due to security incidents. And I'm sure there's several more like that, but these are examples of non-binary security metrics that you can discuss with the provider.
And Claude, this is John. The other thing I'd mention, it's not a metric specifically, but there is the ISO 27017 standard on cloud security. And one of the things you can look for in a service agreement is the provider certification against that particular standard. So that's another consideration in this area as well.
Thanks, John.
Mike Edwards here. The other one that I have seen come up in some discussions, that there is a measurable scale for encryption strength, which the US government has a standard for. So that's an example where you can actually specify a level for encryption that is measurable in the sense that it's measurable against the standard that defines how strong they are. It isn't simply a bit length measurement.
Thank you. And we'll move on to our final question as we wrap up. How is cloud governance generally covered in a CSA?
That's Mike Edwards, I think, since that was my area. I think you would expect to see a whole series of statements in the CSA about how the cloud service is going to be controlled. You should expect to see stuff being reported by the provider, because you can't govern without knowing what's going on. So you need to see those clear statements of how that's going to be done. Ideally, it would be automated with programming interfaces that you can use to get the reports and stuff that you're going to need. And then you should be expecting to see change notifications. You should expect to be seeing process requests for change. All of these things should be part of the cloud service agreement. Without them, you should feel uncomfortable, because it means you can't adequately see what's going on and influence what's going on in the services you're using. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone. Again, the presentation will be posted to the Cloud Standards Customer Council website this afternoon. That's cloud-council.org. We'd like to invite everyone to join us for future events. And I will send you a note, too, following this webinar, so you have a direct link to the presentation, so not to worry about that. A few people asked. So that's great. I hope today was a valuable experience for everyone, and thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.